Today we're going to be wrapping up the series we've been doing based on this book here, Why Buddhism Is True, The Science and Philosophy of Meditation and Enlightenment by Robert Wright. And onward for today, the topic is oneness. Did you hear the one about the Buddhist who went into a pizza parlor? He said to the guy behind the counter, "Make me one with everything." And stay up here and give me a rim shot on that. Just a little humor there. Very little humor. But it's a popular joke. It has several different versions. In another version, it was I think we had there he is. We had the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is the one that walks into the pizza parlor. It says, "Make me one with everything." Another version, it's a hot dog vendor. Get it? One with everything. You get the point, okay? You get the point. Many people think that Buddhism is all about oneness, which is an interesting notion because not all Buddhists agree. Many Buddhists will insist that the Buddha never talked about oneness, or at least didn't talk about it much. And in the book, Robert Wright spends an entire chapter discussing this controversy, and he offers some interesting ideas. And the first thing that he points out is that oneness is a word that people use to describe a particular experience that can arise during meditation. People who have been meditating on a regular basis can have this experience of two different and seemingly unrelated things all of a sudden blur into a single thing with no boundaries between them. Now, for the author, for Robert Wright, it happened while he was at an extended meditation retreat. And he was in the middle of a meditation session. And it started when he noticed a tingling sensation in his foot. Okay, and at about the same time, a bird started singing outside the meditation hall. So here's how he describes it. And here's the odd thing. I felt that the tingling in my foot was no more a part of me than the singing of the bird. You may ask, was I feeling that the singing of the bird was actually a part of me? Or was I feeling that the tingling in my foot wasn't a part of me? To put a less fine point on it, did I feel like I was one with the world, or was I closer to feeling like I was nothing? If you are indeed asking these questions, you've hit on a fascinating philosophical issue that highlights a contrast among different strands of Buddhist thought. At one point, he suggests that maybe some people might be questioning his sanity at this point, although I can't imagine who those people might be, because I suspect that there are some people in this room who have had a similar experience. And as I say, this is a very common experience with people who meditate on a regular basis. Another example. A few years ago, we were talking about another book on Buddhism and Neuroscience. It was called Waking Up by Sam Harris. Remember that one? We did a whole class on it here. Sam is best known as a neuroscientist, and he's also an outspoken atheist. So people were very surprised to hear him writing a book on spirituality. But he was, in fact, a long-time meditator practicing in the Vipassana, the mindfulness insight meditation tradition. So Sam Harris describes a similar experience. But this one didn't happen during meditation. You see, this doesn't always have to happen during meditation. It helps if you've been a long-time meditator. But for Sam, he was visiting the Sea of Galilee in Israel. He was at the place where Jesus most likely gave his famous Sermon on the Mount. Now, here's how he described what happened. As I sat and gazed upon the surrounding hills gently sloping to an inland sea, a feeling of peace came over me. It soon grew into a blissful stillness that silenced my thoughts. In an instant, the sense of being a separate self, an I or a me, vanished. Everything was as it had been: the cloudless sky, the pilgrims clutching their water bottles. But I no longer felt like I was separate from the scene. peering out at the world from behind my eyes. Only the world remained. Very similar to what Robert Wright experienced, and I could give you a dozen more other examples, including some of my own. Sam Harris called this experience selfless consciousness. Selfless consciousness. The experience is the same, but here's where the differences can come into play. People can have the same experience, and they do have the same experience, but they interpret it differently. And those differences usually have to do with culture, personal history, background, things like that. So Sam Harris noted that if he were a Christian, he might interpret the experience through a Christian lens and call it the oneness of God or baptism of the Holy Spirit or something like that. A Hindu might interpret it as Atman becoming Brahman, the individual human soul or essence dissolving into the eternal self that's called Brahman. One group of Buddhists would call it the Dharmakaya of emptiness, while another group of Buddhists would call it the embodiment of the Heart Sutra, where form is emptiness and emptiness is form, and so on. So maybe we can start to see how oneness is just one way of talking about this experience. Not the only way, and maybe not even the best way, although it will do in a pinch, as they say. Actually, I kind of like the idea of calling it selfless consciousness. I think that's a good description based on my experience. But the important thing is that regardless of how we describe the experience or interpret it, it would appear to be universal among people who engage in any kind of meditative or contemplative practice, and it can be a blissful and even an ecstatic kind of thing. And if you were practicing in a formal setting with a teacher, and if you had one of these blissful, ecstatic, oneness, selfless consciousness kind of experiences, and told the teacher about it later on, the teacher would most likely say something along the lines of, well, that's nice, but don't get attached to it. Now in the Zen tradition, I can tell you that they have an even more blunt way of putting it. Zen master Linji was once quoted as saying, "If you meet the Buddha, you must kill the Buddha." That's pretty blunt. In other words, don't start worshiping a peak experience of oneness or selfless consciousness, even if you think it's Buddha or Jesus or Brahman appearing to you and speaking to you personally, because too often people want to learn meditation in order to have those kinds of experiences, to experience bliss, visions, peak experiences, and those things are more like side effects. You often hear them called spiritual consolation, and it can be the kind of thing that keeps one coming back to the practice over and over again. In a sense, it is kind of a payoff, but the mistake is in seeing it as the goal of the practice. It's okay to want to feel better. Meditation, like any spiritual practice, can do that. It's okay to want to feel better, but it's more important to be a better person. That's the real core of spiritual practice, and spiritual practice can certainly help with that too. And by better person, in our Buddhist context here, we're talking about being someone who can avoid what the Buddhists call the three poisons. So here they are, the three poisons: greed, hatred, delusion. And then we expand on those a little bit. We can see that greed isn't just a lust for money and possessions. It can be any kind of attachment or clinging to anything in the hope that the thing will bring us lasting satisfaction and give us the key to happiness and things like that. And it never does. Hatred isn't just about having strong negative feelings towards another person. It includes any sense of aversion or negative feelings toward anything. And hatred won't go away until we deal with aversion in all of its manifestations. Delusion includes ignorance, confusion, and generally just not seeing ourselves and the world around us clearly. Remember what we talked about back in January? One of the central ideas of the book is this one here. The reason we suffer The reason we make other people suffer is that we don't see the world clearly. At the heart of the Buddhist meditative practice is a radical promise. We can learn to see the world, including ourselves, more clearly, and so gain a deep and morally valid happiness. So the Buddha identified the 3 poisons, and fortunately he also gave us 3 antidotes. Here they are. The antidote for greed or attachment, generosity. Non-attachment, generosity, that's something we do when we're not meditating. It means giving. Giving of ourselves, giving of our time, giving money, any form of giving. And non-attachment is what we cultivate during meditation, where we start by not identifying with the thoughts that continuously arise, with not identifying with the feelings and the sensations that arise, and over time we start to lose our tendency to think that we can get happiness by trying to satisfy our desires. The antidote to hatred or aversion is loving kindness, or metta. Metta is a practice in and of itself. Entire books have been written on the subject, and you can go to week-long retreats where they do nothing but metta-type meditation. Karen leads that kind of meditation at least every other month. She did one here this morning, just to kind of refresh your recollection of what that's about. And finally, the antidote to delusion and confusion is wisdom. Learning how to see clearly, or at least more clearly. The wisdom that comes from seeing that going through life trying to satisfy our every desire does not bring lasting happiness. The wisdom that comes from seeing that the boundary of self isn't absolute, and it isn't something that we have to be constantly trying to defend at all costs. Wisdom can come from having that fleeting experience of oneness or selfless consciousness. It can come from letting go of the idea that some people are like weeds, that they have some sort of undesirable weedy essence that turns them into other that we put out there. And when we do that, it makes it a lot easier to practice metta. When we let go of this idea that people have undesirable essences, it makes it a lot easier to engage in that loving kindness practice. All 3 of the poisons work together. One reinforces the others. And the antidotes kind of work the same way too, which is why in Buddhist art, in Buddhist iconography, you see the 3 poisons in a wheel like this. Symbolizes their cyclical nature, the wheel of samsara, they call it, the cycle of suffering. So the bird up there is supposed to be a rooster, standing for greed. The snake symbolizes hatred, and the wild boar is delusion or ignorance. And they're all chasing each other and hanging on to each other's tails in this unending cycle. Now, don't ask me why they picked these particular animals. I didn't grow up on a farm, so I have no idea what makes a rooster particularly greedy. And I always thought pigs were supposed to be smart. Of course, the snake always gets the bad rap, though, right? So that's not a surprise. But the point is that one feeds off the others. And in a similar way, the antidotes also work to reinforce each other, which is why it's important to do more than just sit and meditate, thinking that that's going to do the trick all by itself. I recently saw an article on this neuroscience blog that I follow, this one here called Neurologica. The author is Dr. Stephen Novella, medical doctor. He's a neurologist. And the headline that caught my attention was this next one here. It's, shall we say, provocative. Mindfulness no better than watching TV. That's from last February. Mindfulness no better than watching TV. A recent systematic review and meta-analysis of the effects of mindfulness meditation on pro-social behavior found, essentially, that there is no evidence that it works. And he says, I find these results entirely unsurprising. I agree with them. After I read the entire article and actually went and read the study, the meta-analysis, I too was not surprised, because the claim that was being made that this study was directed to is that sitting on a cushion or sitting in a chair, simply doing mindfulness meditation all by itself makes you a better person, makes you more kind, makes you more compassionate. You see, people are out there, they are selling mindfulness just like any other consumer product. They're telling us, come to my workshop, I'll teach you basically the mechanics of meditation, learn how to sit, learn how to meditate, and you too can be as kind and considerate and compassionate as the Dalai Lama. I think we all know what His Holiness would have to say about that. I call BS. Reminds me of another character. Anyone remember Scotty from the Star Trek series? In one of the movies, he had this great line. He said, and if my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a wagon. Which means you can't just slap meditation on a person and turn them into an enlightened being. It has to happen within a larger philosophical, psychological, and ethical framework that you're practicing. Meditation and oneness only gets us so far. We still need the larger framework, and Buddhist philosophy is a guide that can help us with that practice. Buddhist philosophy gives us guidance, gives us direction. It gives us that larger psychological, ethical, and philosophical framework. It's something that we have to engage and not just sit and think that we're going to become a better person without having a broader understanding of why we're doing what we're doing when we're doing it. That kind of guidance, that kind of direction is what Robert Wright is trying to give us in this book. And he's doing it in a way that's free from any religious or supernatural baggage. That's the value in it. Meditation is good stress relief. So is golf. So is watching TV. It will make us feel better. But if we want to be a better person, if we want to change our life and be a better person, then we have to take the next step. Meditate and immerse ourselves in the teachings and the broader philosophy and the broader ethical framework. Immerse, challenge them, by all means question them, but also let them challenge you. That's what it's all about. See you next week.